Welcome back to Defying Gentrification. I'm your host, Kristen Jeffers, and I'm so excited to finally be able to give you episode 9, like the true episode 9. I know with my 2 special episodes, episode order got off. I've been kind of out of order, but today I have a really radical Black pastor here with us to talk about how the Black church can tap into better urbanism and better ways of doing community with people, Reverend Dr. Andrew Wilkes. And our theme of our episode is faith. We are going through and examining in this season, part of the season, really. I consider this like more of a second season, but of course, when you go to the podcast apps, you may see this as episode 9, may see this as episode 1. Either way, just a little introduction for us today. And after our little break, I will talk more about how we are going to dig into these principles of defying gentrification, how we're going to do podcasts for these next few episodes. And then later on in the episode, we will be talking to Reverend Dr. Wilkes. So once again, this is Defying Gentrification with Kristen Jeffers, and I will be right back. So yes, bookshop.org, and of course, specifically bookshop.org/shop/Kristen Jeffers is, of course, your resource for all the books that I recommend on these episodes. Plenty Good Room by Reverend Dr. Andrew Wilkes, which we'll be talking about later in this episode, is in there, along with a lot of other great books, both past and present, that I've had of authors that I've had on the show, and some of the authors that I'm going to have on the show this season that are coming up. So bookshop.org/shop/Kristen Jeffers to support me directly with Bookshop and give to me. And if not me, there's some other great bookshops on there. I want to give Loyalty here in DC. They're on bookshop.org, as well as some others, but all the money goes directly back to us besides what goes to the publishers. And if you're trying to get off of using that site that starts with an A, especially for books of all kinds, this is a great place to go. So once again, bookshop.org/shop/Kristen Jeffers. And now back to the show. And so we're back. This is Defying Gentrification with Kristen Jeffers. Thanks for taking the time to be here with me. We are doing this first part of our episode before I bring my guest on differently this part of the season. So in this part of the episode, it will still be the concept of a street corner, the concept of a hot topic, but we're going to focus that hot topic on one of my principles of defying gentrification. So this episode, even though we're also going to be talking primarily about how faith plays into defying gentrification, I do want to pause and do a little bit of an introduction to what I mean by that. So in the description box and in the show notes, I'm linking back to 2 emails. Number one, the one I did at the tail end of last year. It was effectively my wishes email. Those of you who've been following all the permutations of my work since 2010 know that one of my traditions of my platform as Kristen Jeffers Media, specifically the part that's the Black urbanist and defying gentrification, is that I make urbanist wishes. And sometimes those urbanist wishes work out exactly as I planned. Other times, well. But I don't despair, because that's one of the things I've learned. But I came back a few weeks later, earlier this month in January, after taking a couple weeks off, logging off of everything, really trying to enjoy the holiday season before we are faced with this moment that we're faced right now. And I wanted to take that time and really think about, okay, is defying gentrification even going to be relevant? Is that the movement we need to make? Is that what we need to do? I'm really just, as you see here, things are a little bit disheveled if you're watching here on the watching on the feed. Should I just hide everything, have my little mess under the blanket, hide myself under a blanket and not say anything? Or do I have something to say for this moment? Well, if you read that email, you will find that I have something to say for this moment. And what I wanted to do is to reconfigure not just the order of the principles of defying gentrification that I touched on way back in November of 2023. I wanted to actually start really digging into them. And I've split the care principle up into both self and community care. Both are needed. And care itself is in the middle for a reason. It is the linchpin. You have to care for yourself, and then you care for your community. And then if you are the person, and once again, let me remind you, this Defying Gentrification is a urbanism centered in my lived experiences as a Black Southerner. And even though I'm light skinned down South, we all Black. If anything, there are some folks down there that are jealous that, I can still through spaces, but no, we still Black here. We still go through certain things as Black, but this Defying Gentrification and how I'm choosing to show up in the world honors that there are some things like attractiveness privilege, even though I'm non-binary femme presenting, and there's things going in here that aren't present out here. That my partner Les, who I'm gonna share a few words from, as of course that's the other surprise, she's gonna be joining us as my co-host this season. But let me finish these principles lines up anyway. Like we need that care, and as a Black person, as a Black feminine person, as a Black person who does shake the gender binary and who shakes up those who feel like there should be only one sexual orientation, because that's also what's alluded to. There should only be two genders. Then there also should only be one sexual orientation. The two genders do the thing with each other, and they do the thing in a certain way. But we don't do all of that over here. We're not all about that. Just like those of us, who are descendants of the African enslaved, that is a legacy. That is where I draw my Blackness from, and I draw from a lot of the faith traditions of that. My faith tradition is blended across a lot of different practitioners of a lot of different ways of tapping into faith and grounding in the spirit realm. I am an animist. I do believe that there's a spirit realm, and I won't go into too much detail in this, but know that that's why faith is first in this list, and know that that's why, this is the order. And yes, I still love cities, even though cities are trying to fail me right now, even though I don't get to use public transit like I want to, even though, this is probably going to be the last time I bring to you the show, those of you who are watching, in this apartment, partly because, it's no secret that I've been going through things. And yes, I am going to link in the show notes, as well as in the description box, the video that I talked about. And I talked about what I've really been going through. I talked about that just about a couple weeks ago, everything from the election to my current community that's surrounding me in DC. They're there, but our professional community has not been there. So it's time for some radical changes. And the way we like to say it in the Black church is like, it's time to step out on faith. So we're about to step out on faith here. And that's a good point to talk about and slice in what Les has to say about faith. She was happy to record this while she was on one of her many Instacart runs she's been doing lately to keep us from losing faith in the concept of making money. So let's hear from her for a moment.
Hi. So I've been asked to reflect on my thoughts around, how faith connects to urbanism. First off, I want to say that in the world of urbanism, because it's so connected to, the government and, and various moving pieces, it's so easy, especially when you're doing anything, in the urbanism field, whether that's planning or transportation or engineering. It's very easy to get caught up in the world because there's, you have to meet so many deliverables. You have to, work with so many different types of people at all levels, in order to achieve the ultimate, mission of whatever your goal and visions, are for your respective companies and organizations, that you're working for. But for me personally, during my time in the space, whether I was doing, community outreach, whether I was, working for a company or even just, talking with people on the bus, as a passenger, this is definitely work where we definitely need to reconnect with spirit. People of all levels in this industry really needs to connect with spirit doing this work, and even reconnecting with spirit. Even, you may be thinking, well, it's impossible for me to really do that because I have to answer to A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but this is way bigger than us. It's way bigger than a deliverable. It's way bigger than, maybe someone of importance on the totem pole. This is ultimately, spirit's work. You may say, well, you know what? I'm atheist. Ultimately, you may say I'm atheist. You may say, well, I'm agnostic. You may say, well, I don't, I'm Buddhist, but no matter, whether you're religious or not, this goes way beyond us. Ultimately, urbanism. And I think that along the years, and a long time, a lot of things have gotten kind of misconstrued on what exactly, it is. And when we're doing this work, it's so important to lead with spirit because ultimately it's so many people that depend on us, whether it's for a road to be fixed, a road to be constructed, for bus routes to be improved or created, for a bridge to be repaired, for people to be able to afford vehicles that may not be popular. However, you may say you're anti-car, for instance, but, what's the Lyft or Uber that you're getting into? What's the ride share or van share, that you're sharing? Those are vehicles, and those are also important. So we have to learn to really learn to see the bigger picture as far as, all of this being an ecosystem, whether it's getting on a bus, whether it's, getting in a vehicle, whether it's, making sure the sidewalks are debris free for our pedestrians, whether it's, making sure that people, have bicycle lanes and bike paths. So it's all an ecosystem. It's not one mode of urbanism being better than the other. Whether the plans that you're working on, whatever planning initiatives you're working on, like, okay, how will this really help the community? Have we gotten the community's input, on this? So not to make this super long, but faith is really thinking of humanity and what humanity needs. And I know during my time, in this space, whether I was, organizing, whether I was in a community group, whether I was working for a company, personally, I've always tried to lead with spirit, no matter who, whether that was a colleague, whether it was, someone, just a citizen, whether it was someone in an apartment building, no matter who I was talking to, I tried to lead with spirit because ultimately, everyone's concerns are valid. And a lot of times we also get so caught up in, oh, well, this person, it doesn't have such and such title, or this person lives in neighborhood X, or this person lives in a bad area, or this person, is only making X amount of dollars a year, or this person's unemployed. And so we get so caught up in social status, socioeconomics, that a lot of times we stray away from spirituality. We stray away and we get so focused on the world. So my thoughts around how your faith and connects with urbanism. And I'm going to tell everyone, even if you're watching this and you're like, I'm not spiritual, I'm not religious, no matter who you worship or who you don't worship, think of this as an ecosystem. Think of this as just humanity, because that's ultimately, where we should be rooted at. You look at your work as a practice. Your job is to better the environment, especially if you have a role in improving and constructing and building our infrastructure. It's important. So, definitely just keep that in mind, when you're doing your day-to-day work, that this gets way bigger than us. It gets way bigger than the company, that you're working for. It gets way bigger than, any plans. You want to make sure that you're really looking at this from a holistic point of view. And ultimately, this is to better serve, our community. It's to better serve. Think about people that, may not get into the weeds of this work, but they're just trying to commute to and from work. They're trying to commute to and from a family or friend's house. Maybe they're going to a doctor's appointment. Maybe they're on their where they're commuting to incorporate some type of self-care in their life. Maybe they're just on a bike path. Maybe they're walking on a trail. Maybe, they're on a boat, depending on our waterways, so when you really think of it that way, beyond just a commute or thinking of this as a fan perspective, or thinking what you think people ought to do, you just got to continue to meet people where they are. And that's also important, in this. So to sum it all up, this is all of us. This is way bigger than any of us individually. And this is us as a whole. So definitely just think of the greater community and think of overall humanity. If it helps you out, just even think about, your friends and family that are just trying to get to and from work. No matter what it is that they do, no matter what level that they're at, no matter what shift they're working, think of it that way. All right, y'all, be good.
And so, yeah, that's where we are. And that's why faith, I want to lead with faith. And the next few episodes, she'll actually be back here on the couch. The blue couch is coming with us. Wherever we're going, the blue couch is coming with us. So she'll be back with me on the blue couch to talk more about like life and everything. And what we're going through, and we'll have more announcements. We'll have more things to do, and we're doing our best. But one thing I will say is I am speaking up because of faith. I am speaking out because I have faith that in my speaking out, my mouth, as it is open, will be fed, like proverbially and physically. I will get food. Like speaking out and everything. Like we've gone and we're eligible for social services, and we've taken advantage of that. We're speaking with our building. Like all those things are happening, and I have no shame. And as this thing about having faith, there's no shame, and having faith, and then cultivating the community, cultivating things ourselves, making things ourselves. Of course, my crochet is part of that. And, I got my little case here, my iPad case, so that we can reduce our dependence on a lot of these things. And not only can we reduce our dependence on some of these things owned by nefarious people, we can recreate those things, because nefarious people don't have a monopoly on the best of humanity and human life. Let me say that again. The nefarious people do not have a monopoly on the concept of faith, spirituality, and humanity. Keep that in mind. Know that I'm watching you just as much as you're watching me. And to anybody, I'm sorry that if you've read some of my posts and you think it's about you, and some of it isn't about you, but some of y'all know who y'all are. Because y'all, even well before, years ago, even back in 2018, like I said in the YouTube video, y'all know who you are. And instead of pretending that I can be somebody I'm not, I'm going to be my 100% self. The southernness, the queerness, the feistiness, the Bama-ness, as it were, since I'm here in DC, and there's those distinctions, those Black in Black community, class distinctions show up. All those things are here, but I am owning them. I am owning myself. I am owning who I am, and I am proud of who I am. And so that is why faith is up top, and thinking about faith, especially as I've been preparing this episode and this video and this, this audio, if you're just listening, that's what's gotten me through. With that, we have our other principles: cultivation, of course, the cares, access, infrastructure, and convenience. And I actually, if you've been following along throughout the last year, convenience has moved to the bottom because, if I don't like myself, I'm not going outside. That's fact. So it don't matter what's convenient. What's convenient for me is my bed if I don't like myself and I don't want to come out of bed. So I've realized that I need to be faithful. I need to cultivate things for myself. My garments, making this media platform, making my own media platform, even though I'm not able to be on other people's media platforms as much as I would like, even though I have an active fear of reaching out to other media platforms. I realized that it's the same internet. I am in support groups that are helping me through those fears, to have that faith, that putting out my words, putting out my pitches, putting out myself is going to be valuable. And I also have faith that I will find the right new home. And in fact, I think I might know what that is, but you're going to have to keep listening and watching for us to reveal what that is. So with that, we're going to take a break. We're going to come back. Right after the break, we will be talking with Reverend Dr. Andrew Wilkes. Reverend Dr. Andrew Wilkes is the co-pastor of the Double Love Experience with his wife, Reverend Dr. Gabby Wilkes. You may have seen them on the Black Church documentary that Dr. Henry Louis Gates did for PBS, which I'm putting all of that in the show notes because you should watch the whole thing. If you want to understand the roots of Black urbanism for real, go to our house of spirit. Go to what drives our brains and what has held us together when all other institutions, especially in these areas, in these colonized spaces, both on our original continent where the colonization has happened, as well as here in the States. Now, the Black Church documentary focuses on the experience in the United States. But there's, of course, other documentaries that talk about how faith has manifested in how Black folks, people of the African diaspora, show up in the world. Anyway, with that's them. He has written, Reverend Dr. Andrew Wilkes is with us today, and he has written a book, Plenty Good Room, that touches on Black Christian socialism, and it challenges our church buildings to not just get comfortable and having land, the buildings, a media platform, and to not get comfortable just telling anybody telling certain churches and people that don't belong in the church to get back to our roots of our radical tradition. Now, of course, not every church is on board with Dr. Martin Luther King's vision. Not every, just like there was criticisms of even that, of Malcolm X, even in his movement and in his faith practice. But ultimately, as a nearly 40-year-old millennial in these times where my rights and my existence as a person in this so-called country on this piece of the land of Turtle Island is challenged, I really hope that you'll get something out of this conversation. And another note is I've got my nice blue snowball right now, but I've had a lot of technical issues. That's why this episode, even though I recorded this interview in October, just before, like a few days before we voted. In fact, I think I recorded the episode one day, a couple days later, I went and voted in my cute little rainbow wig at the library. I'll put that up here for you. For those of you who are watching for your entertainment. Then I punked out it was Halloween day, and I went and kind of played a little trick on my hairstylist when I came in with my wig. But, and then, yeah, we voted. And here we are. And one other thing, but I say all that to say about the technical issues, the audio on this part of the episode is a little scratchy, but I'm here. And one other thing, well, actually, I'll save that to after. So we're going to take a break, sell some books. We'll be talking with Reverend Dr. Wilkes. And then after that part of the conversation, we will come back and close out our episode today and preview our next one. Once again, this is Defying Gentrification with Kristen Jeffers, and I am speaking now with Reverend Dr. Andrew Wilkes. Peter. Welcome back, y'all, to the Defying Gentrification podcast. This is a really exciting episode, and I have with me today Reverend Dr. Andrew Wilkes, who is the author of Plenty Good Room. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Wilkes, for joining me today on this podcast.
Absolutely. A pleasure to be here.
Yes. And so I wanted to talk about going back. There's so much in this book, and in the prior segment, I've teased why folks should consider picking up this book.
Oh.
But one of the things I love to do with episode guests is to take it back. Like, before you found your call to ministry, before, like, what influenced you? What were sort of your first touch points to, I would say, like city planning, urbanism, community development? Was it something that you found was instilled by your parents? Was this part of your church community? And I'll share kind of a little bit of my story, but I want to hear like what those influences are, because as many people know, if you listen to anything or read anything, I start from the beginning as well. So
yeah. Wonderful. Well, I appreciate the question, and again, such a joy to be on the podcast. A few influences come to mind. One I talk about in Plenty Good Room, how the first protest civic engagement event I ever went to was actually in like the parking lot of a grocery store that the Concerned Black Clergy of Atlanta put on. Reverend Dr. Barbara King was the person who convened it. And though memory has taken away my sense of what we talked about, that was my first recollection of quasi-public space being used for democratic purposes and calling for more justice and more equity. So that's one kind of key input. Another that helped to shape my sense of city planning and what local governments and organized communities can do. When I was a student at Princeton Theological Seminary, before I had gray hair many moons ago, I did what's called a field placement for about a year and a half in the office of then Mayor Cory Booker. And so while a lot of my colleagues were doing their field placements in congregations, I was doing mine in local government, working on housing issues, working with community centers and thinking through how green jobs can potentially come online. And so those two experiences, organizing with churches and parking lots and being in local government in Newark, New Jersey, gave me a sense of what might be possible in terms of justice and equity exceeds direct service, exceeds charitable initiatives, and requires engaging policy structures, systems, regulations, and all that good stuff.
Sure. Like, so one of the things, like, I was really struck by, because in my work, now my journey in and out, I also was raised National Baptist. So, yeah. But of course, I'm a queer woman, so there are complications.
There are all the dissonance that should not exist, but nevertheless, from their side does, yeah.
Yes, but there's always been, I've always seen the work that I'm doing, whether it's being on a podcast like this, writing The Black Urbanist, being in the community, as a calling. Like, I watched my dad, like, fix not just all the lights at like Ebenezer Baptist in Greensboro, but fix so many people's congregations, pretty much a lot of Black Greensboro. Like, so it was, even though he wasn't in a pulpit necessarily, he was using his gift as a licensed electrician to help so many people. And that implanted on me. Then, of course, my mom was a school teacher and made sure I was reading everything, including my Bible and everything else in between.
Sure.
But it started for me seeing our communities not represented well. I was in my first semester at UNC Greensboro in the public affairs program. And I was like, okay, we as Black Southerners, we have a different experience. It's not to say that we don't have public housing. We definitely do. and there's been all sorts of complications with it in the past 11 years since I was in my grad program. But we also have land access. Later on in this season, I'm going to be talking with Bria Baker about her wonderful book, Rooted. But of course, like, this has been like a calling. And I thought that was such a wonderful thing to portray, that you can be called outside of a pulpit to do this work. Like, I feel like some of our elders presented that to us.
Sure.
But do you feel like that some of the things, obviously you felt like it was time to put this together in a book and that we had to like be clear about it? Like, what was sort of the catalyst to say, okay, this is the time, other than obviously time and prayer and study, like, I'm not so far removed, like, since we talked about this being a ministerial calling, what was it? Was it the onset of seeing COVID-19 affect our communities? Was it, say, the 2016 presidential election? Was it the Great Recession? What was sort of that nudge that this needs to be even more part of your ministry, other than what you've already done, which people will see in the bio and which I'll talk a little bit about later in the episode?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. So I come to this work at this stage as a co-pastor of a church I co-founded with my wife, Reverend Dr. Gabby Cudjoe-Wilkes, a trained political scientist. When I went to seminary, actually, it was on the edges of the Great Recession. And so I saw this juxtaposition of the federal government bailing out banks while Black homeowners in Southwest Atlanta, which is where I grew up, not receiving even an adequate response, just suboptimal. It's one thing to try and you don't really get where you want to go, but it wasn't really an A+ for effort. And so the juxtaposition of intervention for banks, next to none for Black homeowners who ended up being foreclosed in a substantial way, both in Atlanta as well as New York, where I am ultimately based. Those kind of experiences over time just kind of stuck with me. And being involved in what I would call, Kristen, the kind of radical wing of the Black social gospel, which is, there are not too many folks running around that are Black Christian socialists in a generous way.
Yes.
That it just kind of felt like it was time to release this. And the name Plenty Good Room draws from two different senses. One is a sense of hospitality and welcome. Whosoever will ought to have a space in a faith community, ethically oriented sense of belonging. But also, I argue that there's an anti-scarcity conviction that's the best of Black church traditions. How do we get from a text that says the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof to a place where we're reinforcing the austerity politics of your Ronald Reagans and across the pond, your Margaret Thatchers? And so
yes.
In many ways, the Great Recession kind of planted some of that. But things like COVID-19, the pandemic, and also just a sense of inner urge, which is both cultivated over time. And I would say, yeah, some of that I felt I am still good in church, felt the Holy Ghost telling me now's the time to move.
Yes. I'm like, I probably know the answer. It's probably going to be an unction of the Spirit.
Yeah. All of the above.
I was listening. So some of you may not know, I haven't talked a lot about it to my listeners, but I grew up in a National Baptist church with one parent who left a United Methodist congregation and one parent who left an AME congregation. But of course, it's the Black Southern Church. We're on the circuit. We're in the country. We're making that rotation. So there are definitely going to be, in addition to the book title being a reference to a colloquial term we use in the Black church, especially in the South, U.S. South, we're also going to use certain other terms. But this is probably going to be a conversation for, like, if you know, because I really did. And I was really excited to have like a Black church focused conversation around these things, because so much, nothing wrong with the fact that in our generation, and honestly, really our parents' generation, for many of us. Now, some folks are fortunate where it was their grandparents, like you were the first to go to university and and graduating from HBCUs and having that legacy. For me and my family, it was, I like to say I'm like 1.5 because my dad did community college, almost went to A&T. My mom went to
Come
Bennett.
on, Aggies.
Yes. And I am in an Aggie and Bell household.
Okay.
Yeah, they sent me to NC State, which if you know, you know. We have a pretty robust Black alumni network. We have D9 presence. We have like gospel choir, all these things. And one of the things they instilled in us was this sense of place and this sense of our Blackness, the Sankofa principle. So I brought all of like my Black church upbringing to this predominantly white institution in 2004 as like a second generation, as my grandparents who weren't able to finish, like one of them was stopped at the 7th grade and went to World War II. Another one went back and got her community college so she could basically to be the first cafeteria manager, Black cafeteria manager in Alamance County, which was still a big deal in like the 80s. Yeah. So there was this pride because it was my mom going to Bennett, my uncle going to NC State, and I followed him there. So there was definitely a through line of I didn't just go over there by myself, but just where we now, I feel like in the Black church, take it for granted that we have these resources. And I would love for you to talk a little bit more, and we'll get back to the book, but I would love for you to share a little bit more about it was a documentary I saw during like the height of the pandemic, when y'all decided to just take an alleyway and create a worship service and create that experience. And even though we live in a world of mega churches, of big buildings, of projection screens, the church experience looks more like the television show Greenleaf than sitting on a street corner in the kind of the 2 or 3 gathered mode of things.
Yeah.
Take us back to like creating that space and place and creating a model that we don't often see, at least not in this modern, wealthier Black church.
Yeah, really great question. So in 2018, my wife and I co-founded Double Up Experience Church, and we did a series of preview services. And so in 2019, in the 4th quarter, that's when we moved from quarterly services to weekly services. 4 months into that, the pandemic hit. And so that threw us for a bit of a regrouping moment. We found our footing again. And we're now actually coming up on our 6th anniversary. So incredibly excited about that. And the outdoor service that you're mentioning is something that we actually do with the Hancock Community Garden Park. And we're thrilled to have PBS join us for the Black Church documentary that Dr. Henry Louis Gates is doing. And they kind of featured Double Up Experience Church, which we describe as a Jesus movement for Black lives. And for us, a part of what that means is the church not viewing itself as a monocentric resource for community impact and justice work, but really a kind of a polycentric model, meaning that the church is one anchor institution and there are other institutions like parks, like the Bed-Stuy Restoration Plaza, which is where we're currently worshiping, which happens to be the nation's, by some accounts, first community development corporation. And so a lot of the stuff that churches usually do in terms of social services, in terms of legal representation, in terms of connecting with electeds, we're currently like in the hub of a community hub. And so whether it's the community garden park or working at Restoration Plaza, we're trying to really be a love and justice congregation instead of some of the majoring in the minor that churches lamentably have developed something of a reputation for. And so we're not the only ones, but we're glad to be a part of a vanguard of folks trying to make a difference in this way.
So as far as like the mechanics of that, did you have to have y'all had to call yourselves in a way to this particular form of ministry to be able to operate in this way? Or do you have the backing of like a mainstream or like Black mainstream denomination at this point?
Yeah, so Double Up Experience is a part of the Progressive National Baptist Convention, which is Dr. King's denomination. Dr.
Okay.
King grew up in the NBC, but
Hmm.
broke off into PNBC
Hmm.
because everybody in NBC wasn't necessarily with the civil rights and racial
Yep.
justice push, whereas
Yep.
King and others said this is not only important civically and politically,
Hmm.
but for those who happen to be Christians in a specific generous Black church tradition,
Hmm.
civil rights and racial justice are constitutive rather than add-ons for
Hmm.
faith commitment.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of set the tone for that because for many, I'm hearing this question from listeners that are like, okay, that's great that you're doing that. You know, of course, there's like history of so many Black folks saying, okay, the church is standard, it doesn't fit me, it's not going in a direction that I believe is conducive to the liberation of Black lives and honestly anybody's lives. Like,
Yeah.
it's not looking like
Go there. Go there.
yeah, it's not looking biblical in a lot of ways. We love to talk about what is and isn't biblical, but here we are. And one of the things that has broken my heart about watching like us amass so many resources as a Black church and then have to debate people constantly, especially in this election season, that, oh, well, why do you still care about what the Black church thinks? Why do we even organize? Like, I want to kind of shout out one of my colleagues in Greensboro, April Parker, who's really put a lot of effort in making sure people remember that the Black church was an organizing tool historically in Greensboro. Of course, we've had obviously Beloved Community Center, Faith Community Church, the Pulpit Forum. You know, we've had this history continue. And of course, we're Greensboro. So, of course, like
Sure,
you're from
sure.
Atlanta, I'm from Greensboro. Like, you would hope that somebody will still be doing what we started to do.
Disruptive activism and
Yes.
sit-ins and so forth. Sure, sure, sure.
But I think what this book is giving an opportunity for, it's like I wish I was in a position to mail it to every congregation, especially every Black congregation, including my home congregations that are still more on that conservative end. Now, they're in smaller buildings. They're still doing the fish fries. They're still making sure everybody's okay. But then there's smaller congregations. Like,
Yeah.
whereas, you know, you have some of the other congregations, larger congregations in Greensboro and here in PG County where I'm based, where it's like, oh, you go here and you have to go in this building and you have to put some of your identities at the door because the only way in is through our current federal government apparatus. It's almost like, to be honest, I'll flat out say it. I feel like it's become an idol. Like, I feel like we've lost our creativity, at least in this region, to be able to think through a lot of what you're talking about in the book. And that's why I was just so excited. I was like, okay, we have to have this conversation because we have so many assets. We have so many organizers. We have so many teachers and nurturers. So many folks are taking their kids to church because they want like a structure. They want to kind of show them what it's like to have a moral structure. And then, of course, you know, one of the other things I loved about seeing it, y'all in the documentary is y'all got the older music. Like, I love now. I am a millennial, and I am at that cusp. And nothing against some of our other worship teams that have a different sound, but I like the variety. Just like I have a variety anyway. I like that variety. And I think there was a book, and I will probably drop it in my show notes because it's escaping me, but there was a book, I know it was a sister who wrote a book about the sonics of Black lives. And to me, like, just like we have our hair shops as a site of being able to be purely Black in a society that doesn't want us to be there. To me, the Black church is one of those places. And so talk about how you see that. Like, I know kind of my theory base is like, yeah, we have this building, we've built this. Is somewhat safe in some ways. I won't say completely safe because of course we've seen so many horrible attacks even within the last 15 years on the Black church. Everything from what happened at Emmanuel AME to just other, you know, lack of support,
True.
people losing their assets, gentrification, and people being kind of not on the side of, oh, well, we have a good sweetheart deal with whatever city we're in where we're avoiding gentrification, but they're trying to take our building. They're charging us property tax. So talk to me about how you have seen the institution as part of like a street front as a community. Like you kind of touched on it a little bit, but I would love for you to talk a little bit more about how you see the institution and your institution in particular as part of like the holisticness of the community.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. When you were talking about music and churches, it reminds me of a really great book. I think her first monograph by Melissa Harris Perry called Barbershop Bibles and BET. And so in that work of political science, Paris kind of drawing together the fact that so much of Black politics is not only about who are we going to elect from the president, the mayor, the governor, school board, what have you, but there are also these everyday sites of liberation. Sometimes that's barbershops, beauty salons, over questions of faith. Certainly at the cookout is another deliberative sort of space. And that very much resonates in some ways with my own kind of formation, upbringing, and kind of current environs. In terms of the church as an institution, I think a part of what we see in terms of how I think the best of Black churches work to create what I call a people's economy. A number of churches have credit unions, which create non-predatory financial institutions where folks can have access to funds that they may need to take care of basic household expenses and to support loved ones in a time of need and to provide something other than check cashing and predatory loans and banks that prey on you, P-R-E-Y, rather than prey in the more positive sense that you get where you're trying to go. And so churches have also historically been, particularly in places like Philadelphia, the site of emergence for burying the sick, and the Free African Society, which preceded the foundation of the AME Church, also helped to provide a kind of a mutual insurance, a kind of sort of shared risk, shared benefit sort of approach. And so I think that kind of public finance for the common good tradition, albeit at a small scale, is what churches have done in a really rich way. And some of that because it's not simply an attempt to advance the common good in a post-racial sense, but advance the common good through public or community finance in a way that disrupts white supremacy. We've seen your Emmanuel AMEs be under attack, but we've also seen just a couple of years ago, Metropolitan AME Church in DC, right, where the Proud Boys saw them saying Black Lives Matter. They pulled down their flag and were brought to court because sometimes you got to settle matters through judicial institutions. And they were awarded $1 million settlement because of some of the damage that they endure. And so I say all that to say that the church, when it is at its best in the public interest, creating conditions where neighbors can love one another, it is a threat, I would argue, to the social organization of racial capitalism. It is a threat to white supremacy, and it is a proponent, I argue, for reparative democracy, participatory democracy, and for economic democracy. And those strands of democracy, Kirsten, I want to say that that's requires a deeper register of beloved community talk than simply copying and pasting whatever the Democratic Party says, which unfortunately is sometimes what you see from the Black church. You're going out of touch, Chris. I can't quite hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay, I'm gonna switch microphones and let everybody know the sound went out a little bit.
Okay.
But yes, so what I wanted to talk about is you were talking about how sometimes we can create institutions. Sometimes we have to go into the institutions. And of course, we're in this historical election season, and there's excitement, and and it's so hard because, of course, for my grandparents, they would have never fathomed to be able to vote twice. Now, all of them have passed on. I lost my last grandparent in 2020, but and honestly, if COVID hadn't happened, she might still be here in time to cast this vote. And she would have been able to vote for a Black man and a Black woman for the president of this so-called country and empire. But I've got like a two-part question. And the first part is how would you, in our parlance, rebuke some of these congregations that will probably read your chapter on unions, and even though they are effectively operating as corporations, with this understanding that you have to give a certain amount on Sunday, you have to give a certain amount, you effectively have to pay. And the way their tithing structure is set up is feeling like you're paying to go to a positive Black space instead of just giving your time or giving your like space, or thinking about like, okay, you're a credit union. Okay, you use some of that tithing to provide the senior housing. The senior housing is free, or it's like very, very low cost, but it's based on what the person actually has, versus so many of our churches that are market rate, that have full-on HR teams. Nothing wrong with that, because you do need like accountability. But what do you say to these churches that want to operate more as corporations and that will sit and read this account, even though by all means they're gonna like see you as a Black straight reverend doctor, well regarded, you know, you and your wife being in, well, now I know some congregations can't get over the fact that it's you and your wife is in ministry, so we're gonna put them to the side. They might not even touch the book. But say the ones that do touch the book and they're okay with everything until you're saying, hey, you know, we need to unionize. We don't need to be creating these like weird financial structures. We don't need to mirror, in our parlance, the world and how we operate. What have you been saying to some of those questions you may have been getting from ministerial colleagues that are with you on a lot of pro-Black space, you know, be part of our Black community, but wait, so we're supposed to do all the economic piece as well in this day and time? How am I supposed to manage property, people's personalities? How am I supposed to finance my church in this model?
Yeah, really great question. And would approach in a couple of ways. One, I have the joy of serving as the board president for the Labor Religion Coalition in New York State. And through that capacity, we've been supporters of the New York State wing of the Poor People's Campaign, which was one of the principal acts that not only Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Helped to establish and get going, but also Marion Wright Edelman was really the kind of genesis and the brains of kind of getting the Poor People's Campaign moving. And so the economic justice and equity piece, I argue, is not a distraction or side dish, but is really the main course of what Black social Christianity is all about. I acknowledge that there are some operational distinctions between a congregation like Double Up, which is on the smaller end of congregations, and folks who may see, as in a church that I used to serve in, the mega church in New York, tens of thousands of folks that are coming through. Even in that context, I think there is, and for mega churches and congregations across the country, is to, at minimum, argue for and to have advocacy positions that support paying people, families, sustaining wages, to make sure that city governments, town governments, state governments are investing in things like worker co-ops, supporting legal protections for folks so that there's not wage theft that is happening or harassment happening in the workplace. What happens in the workplace, it's just as important and should be just as sacred a space as what happens and set aside spaces on Sunday. And the other things I would note that I tried to include, I was with some folks for the Alliance of Baptists, a denomination that is a mixture of white and Black congregations. And a part of what I was lifting up there is that churches, essentially are following a Christ who became, or so goes the confession, God becomes human as a day laborer, as
Mm-hmm.
someone who's unhoused and has
Mm-hmm.
nowhere to lay
Mm-hmm.
the
Yeah.
head, as someone
Yeah.
who invites folks to walk off the job, essentially,
Yeah.
and form a labor union. And
Yes.
so this common purse, this day laboring, unhoused Christ is the one who is the guide, who is the
Mm-hmm.
model. And that
Mm-hmm.
um, Jesus talk, that Christology ought to radicalize congregations to
Mm-hmm.
recover some of what we may have lost along the way. So rather than rebuking, I try to think of it as an encouragement that calls
Yes.
folk into the best of our traditions.
No, and honestly, that's good because, of course, we're having so many wonderful conversations in mental health spaces. Number one, that we
Absolutely.
should be going to therapy. That is still part of, that is still a
100%.
divine practice to
100.
take time and sit with someone who is trained and who wants to help you understand how to think. And also the revolution that we're having in our homes, raising our children.
Yeah.
Many of us, because that's what we were taught, spankings, like all these things happen. But now we are looking at that in its proper context. We're looking at the generational trauma and how some of those practices of, tough parenting led back to our times of enslavement as when we were brought over here. And then, of course, everything else of this fear of we have to do things a certain way, just like I was talking about earlier in the show
Yeah.
about feeling like we have to work a certain way, we have to show up a certain way. And that's where I get to like the other part of my question, because as we're getting into, I probably will release this within the time period where people will still be voting, but
Okay.
still, even if we're after November 5th, like one of the things I've been evaluating, especially with our movement folks and especially principled struggle, is thinking about, okay, are we equipped right now to gently overthrow like our version of like Pharaoh's kingdom right now? Do we have enough critical mass? Like we're of like mind where say something bad happens, we're thinking about how we're going to organize, just like we did with COVID, just like I'm watching folks in Asheville and of course folks that I'm connected to in North Carolina mobilize and get people resources. And people, if somebody on one hill still got lights and somebody doesn't, like they're
Yeah.
offering their shower. Like there's so much of that I think is ingrained and people are ready for that kind of service and mutual aid and looking out for each other.
Yeah.
But I do worry sometimes that some folks in their critique forget that they're trapped in rhetoric. And in some cases that their escape plans are a little further along. And some of those escape plans are not like holding in everybody. Like this
Yeah.
isn't necessarily like a book question, but this is mainly like a rooted community focused like pastor and person who's like, okay, if the worst happens to my community, like talk to me a little bit. And obviously we don't want to put all of our cards on the table. Our movement elders have been like, don't tell everybody
Sure,
everything,
sure, sure, sure.
but just in general, kind of giving some advice to people on things they want to make sure they have in order just in case the worst happens. Because I'm in that catchment area. I know we're getting ready. The fences are already going up. I know we won't have metro service. It's not my favorite like thing to think about not having mobility. But I
Yeah.
lived through January 6th and we were living a little further out, like in Prince George's County. So it's like, okay, how would you practically prepare for a time period such as this, that when we need to make some real changes, we need to not just focus or push the Democratic Party, but what if we end up in a situation because people say, okay, I don't even want to trust in them no more, but here we are with Project 2025. Here we are with folks marching the streets, taking their own matters in their hands. what have been some of the things that you've been doing to prepare for that as somebody who is a community minded, like spatially minded pastor?
Yeah, no, really great question. And I appreciate the opportunity to clarify. While I think it's the case that, visions of incrementalist, means tested approaches to equity, which is generally what the Democratic Party gives, are not great. Project 2025 and what the GOP is giving is 1,000 times worse.
Yeah.
And so that
Yeah.
needs to be named directly. To your broader question about what does it look like to be prepared in worst case scenarios, I think you really struck an excellent analogy in naming that we've seen aspects of this in
Mhm.
natural disasters that really
Mhm.
called us to make sure that we have contact information for folks so that we
Mhm.
can check up on them in ways that are not restricted only to email, or only to phone, or only to one particular medium. Having encrypted communication is something that can be helpful. I think it's important to have a sense of and many others have made these points, how one can access food and
Mhm.
having systems of whether it's community fridges, whether it's having community supported agriculture and other forms of gardening. Folk got to eat. If you can't eat,
Yeah.
you can't really live on a
Yeah.
sustainable
Yeah.
basis, right? So those are important things, but also making sure that people have the medicine that they need, that they have the capacity, particularly if they're homebound, to have someone to check up on them just for companionship and company. And so I think disasters of a natural sort give us a glimpse of what we may need to be prepared to do if we encounter civic and political disasters. And no one has blueprints and crystal balls
Mhm.
for this, but we do have reference points. And though history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And so we
Yeah.
can stitch together our reference points and try to create paths of freedom and sustainability, and also collective self-governance. While I don't think we have to be beholden to the state necessarily,
Mhm.
I think it's worth noting that activities once done by the state can be done at a smaller scale by communities until such time that they can be um, done at a larger scale. And I think one example of this, it's not a clean example, but I'll share it for the purposes of succinct communication. The Black Panthers and St. Augustine Episcopal Church are doing free breakfast programs that
Mhm.
ultimately become the template for
Mhm.
feeding programs in public schools. And so those
Mhm.
who wonder, well, what did we get from the Panthers? What are their continuing legacy? If your kid is eating, that's a part of
That's
the Panthers' legacy.
yes.
And so
Yes.
it's important. They weren't doing that necessarily with the theory of change of having the state take on those efforts,
Yeah.
but it was working so powerfully that
Mhm.
it also became something that municipal governments, county governments took on. So I think there's a practical ground between making sure folks have what they need and demanding not just a portion of what we need, but demanding um, all that we deserve, all that we desire, and continuing to push on a systemic front, even as we do what we can individually, and for a congregation like ours that often is federating with other folks who are
Mhm.
doing that kind of work.
And then I think I wanted to end the podcast with sort of this question. And it may come off a little bit shady because this is more of thinking about how our Southern upbringing, because there's been a lot of debate within our
Yeah,
Black community. A lot of people are realizing the concept of as goes the South, so does everybody else. And not just the US South, but really the global South, as it were.
sure.
Do you feel like, and feel free to kind of expand on this since it's kind of the last question, but and I think would be a good way to end this.
Hmm.
Like, I know for me, I've had to realize as I've lived out of state, out of home. Everybody is still in North Carolina for the most part. Now I do have a little chunk, a couple cousins that preceded me up here to DC, but
Uh-huh.
it's been 9 years for me. And I went to
My, almost
Kansas.
10. Congratulations
Yes,
to you.
yes, I know. And I find myself looking back, kind of that Sankofa principle. Like it's been
Yeah.
a Sankofa season for me looking back and
In
thinking
order to go
about,
forward. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yes, yeah, and thinking about, okay, how do we impress on people that maybe they shouldn't be ashamed of their roots? That,
Mm,
how if you have that legacy, that there's probably some lessons in that.
yeah.
How have you navigated that? Like as you when as you've left the South and as you've worked, and obviously you've rooted yourself, you've built a community outside of the South. How do you see some of your Southern upbringing not, as influencing how you've built that community? And of course, you have, it's not like it goes away, but I have noticed, and I myself admittedly have been working on, okay, how do I plug into this community? How do I bring some of that energy there? And yes, of course, we're in the DMV, so we're fighting over whether we're the South or not. So
Yeah. Yeah.
there's that whole thing.
Among other things for statehood
Yes, yes.
as well. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Excellent question. I view growing up in the South and Atlanta in particular as an incredible blessing and heirloom, which
Mm-hmm.
I steward and hold close. The best of Atlanta. Um, Helped instill a sense of my home church's slogan was living to love, loving to serve. And
Mm-hmm.
I think of it as serving to try to make a transformative difference. So that's one piece. Um, Dr. King is from Atlanta,
Mm-hmm.
America's most famous
Yes.
democratic socialist, among other
Yes.
things, and
Yes.
anti-imperial socialist, I should
Yes.
note, because
Yes.
some who hold to the moniker of democratic socialist um, don't necessarily want to see reparations in a global sort of sense,
Mm-hmm.
and so are quite
Mm-hmm.
comfortable with excessive debt service from the International Monetary
Yes.
Fund and from the World
Yes.
Bank, creating neo-colonial conditions for
Yep.
folks in South America and many nations in
Yeah. Yeah.
on the continent. And so I am very real sense value your expansion of the frame from not only the South of the US, but the South is in the global South. That very much resonates. And in some ways, I hold that as a part of the heirloom and the
Yeah.
tradition. But also the sense that I would note in a slightly different direction. I think a part of what Atlanta has helped me to appreciate is the role of story, song, and culture in creating, inspiring, and sustaining social change. Atlanta
Mm-hmm.
has been um, a kind of cauldron and hotbed for so much of the best of what we've seen of soul, R&B,
Mm-hmm.
rap music is
Mm-hmm.
the trap as well. I don't want to leave
Yeah.
that out.
Oh
Coming from
no.
the South,
Oh no.
and that's key because sometimes in movement spaces and just to see church spaces, you miss the opportunity for inspiration because if sermons and points of connection are solely about justice stuff, which sometimes you win, sometimes you lose,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you miss the praise and worship and you miss the inspiration,
Mm-hmm.
or like what is a direct action and movement space without chants and without songs and without
Yeah.
art on
Yeah.
placards? So Atlanta very much gave me that sense of the Black arts movement was a thing I grew up on the maybe 10-ish or so years afterwards, growing up in 85.
Yeah. Yep.
So
Yep.
very
Yep.
much, yeah, very
Yeah.
much an appreciation just to kind of maybe try to tie a bow on it. What I carry with me from Atlanta and from the South by extension is deep practicing and respect for the premise that religion, and I'm riffing on Eric Fromm here, doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have to be authoritarian religion.
Mm-hmm.
Religion can be humanitarian religion.
Mm-hmm.
And if so, we can have an appreciation and motivation for how all of God's people can steward power, can
Mm-hmm.
share resources together, and can make of a world too entranced by austerity and scarcity, a world instead organized on the basis of sufficiency and plenty good room for all.
That's excellent. Like and this is kind of this season, I'm going to be highlighting a lot of my fellow Southern millennial thinkers, Black thinkers like
Yeah.
yourself. we might pop up one Sunday because,
Hey, you all
and
will be welcome.
likewise, let us know, we're right here by Riverside. So of course, I do communicate with Reverend Mia. I owe them a visit. There's so many
A
places.
dear friend
Yeah.
of mine and Gary's. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I'm making my plans. And of course, my partner, Les, both of us have thought about seminary. So who
Yeah.
knows? We might be colleagues in another way, but Reverend Dr. Wilkes, it has been a pleasure. Let us not be strangers. And of course, everybody else listening, we're going to take a little break. We're going to talk a little bit more about the book. And then, of course, we'll wrap up there. So once again, thanks for listening to Defying Gentrification. And of course, Reverend Dr. Wilkes, thanks for coming by.
A joy to stop by.
Of course, you are probably tired of me at this point hyping up my bookshop.org store, but it's serious. It's real. It works. And I am, of course, part of this. I wouldn't be the person I am today without books. I was nurtured to write books early, and very, very soon I will have a book with an ISBN on this site. I won't just be selling books. I will have books. But in the meantime, bookshop.org/shop/Christine Jeffers. If you purchase from my bookstore, it'll help me get to that goal sooner. It will keep this podcast on a regular schedule. And you can say that you are supporting despite what is going on in this raggedy so-called country. You can say that you have supported a queer person, a Black person, a dynamically disabled, chronically ill person, as well as somebody who is middle class-ish. I mean, we got a few things, but that kind of keeps the witness going. Anyway, bookshop.org/shop/Christine Jeffers. And now let's end this show. Hey, y'all, we are finally at the end of this show. It has taken us a mighty long time to get to the end of and getting you this story and this thoughts around making plenty good room and infusing faith in your practices. And one thing I will say, part of the reason it's taken a while is because, of course, we in America have been going through it. Honestly, a lot of us have been going through it for a very long time, and this isn't nothing new. But what I will say is this: we cannot be legislated out of existence. Now, they might try to hold us down. They might try to constrain us. And of course, those of you who are watching and monitoring how these products are being pushed out of stores and these companies don't want to help us. But you know what we can do? We can help each other. And so what my hope is with this Defying Gentrification, at least for this calendar year, we're going to be kind of on a monthly schedule for Defying Gentrification. Clearly, I'm recognizing, it's already February 1. But what a perfect day to record and finalize this and have this up in your podcast players. Of course, I'm from Greensboro. February 1 means something. And speaking of Greensboro, you might be seeing more of me. Maryland, you definitely gonna see more of me. That's our game plan. And in the show notes, I've provided some ways that you can help us with that ultimate goal to get situated, to release ourselves from this crisis of faith. And yes, to continue to keep this podcast up and running, because once again, this is a podcast hosted, produced, and sourced and researched and all of that. It's by me. Les will be joining me for episodes this season. We'll also be having similar guests like Reverend Dr. Andrew Wilkes, who, once again, thanks for coming through. We needed that word. I needed that conversation for myself. And that's what this season is really going to focus on. It's going to focus on me returning more to elements of myself and my abundance. The new Defying Gentrification framework that we're going to go through in this part of the season. You can consider this like a season 2, but I'm going to number it. In the podcast apps, it'll be numbered in consecutive order. That's what we're going to be talking about, because we're going to need tools, because revolution starts in the body. And so much of what's being opposed is people's bodies showing up in places where people want them to be controlled. So Don't let, as much as possible, don't let them control you. As much as possible, control, like, honor yourself and do fun things. And that's another thing. I'm going to be doing a lot more work with Chris Pattern. So you'll actually see more Chris Pattern stuff pop up in your YouTube feeds, on social media, all of those things that are all those platforms, because, you know, a feminine person would love to rock some more fits that they made, considering that, you know, supplies, clothes, all of that going up as of today. So until next time, you know, do everything you can. Personally, let's start with ourselves to defy gentrification. Don't beat yourself up if you can't do it immediately, because the ultimate goal is to come together collectively and end gentrification, all other injustices and wrongs here on this one earth that we have.